Good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to this evening's Derek Ippen lecture, which will be given by Kristen Renwick Monroe with the title Third Reich, Émigrés, and Traumatic Political Change. This is an especially important lecture for us, an especially important topic. It has to do with several forms of what might be called the macro history of the American Academy, and equally importantly with the micro history of the American Academy. The macro history involving basic questions of political and moral history, as well as the theory of how to engage these kinds of things involving the period of the Third Reich, the Holocaust and its immigration. And the micro-history, as many of you here, or most of you here, will know, involving the history of this house, a German-Jewish banking family villa appropriated by Nazi officials after 1933, after 1938, and the house of the Kellen and Arnhold family, who in the 1990s returned to Berlin not to live, but to endow this building and really give it the kind of spirit that it had had in the 1920s and 1930s. So there's a special resonance, Kristen, to the talk that you'll give tonight, and one that we're really always aware of in these spaces. We're also extremely grateful to Dirk Ippen, our trustee, for endowing the fellowship and lecture. Dirk Ippen is a publisher based in Munich who endowed the fellowship in his name in 2012 for one fellow annually with the aim of fostering transatlantic exchange in journalism and academic disciplines. Kristen Renwick Monroe is Chancellor's Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Irvine, and the Director of the UCI Interdisciplinary Center for the Scientific Study of Ethics and Morality, as well as the Associate Director of the program in Political Psychology. She earned her PhD in Political Science in 1974 at the University of Chicago. Her first book, Presidential Popularity and the Economy, revealed that much of the so-called great debates over voting reflected the orientation of the analyst. Her later trilogy on altruism and moral choice during the Second World War, which draws on narrative interviews of people caught in war, addresses a central problem in normative political science and ethics, namely how people treat each other. Each book in the eventual trilogy, all published by Princeton Press, The Heart of Altruism, The Hand of Compassion, and finally Ethics in an Age of Terror and Genocide, has won an APSA, American Political Science Association, Best Book Award. 2 were nominated for a Pulitzer Prize and National Book Award. The Heart of Altruism, Perceptions of a Common Humanity, 1994, revealed the political significance and the psychological roots of altruism and focused attention on how political choices are constrained by identity. Monroe tested the major explanations of altruism through a narrative analysis of in-depth interviews with philanthropists, Carnegie Hero Commission recipients, and rescuers of Jews during the Holocaust. The Hand of Compassion, Portraits of Moral Choice During the Holocaust, 2004, created intricate portraits of rescuers of Jews during the Holocaust, advancing Professor Monroe's view of how an altruistic perspective creates a feeling of moral salience. And Ethics in an Age of Terror and Genocide, Identity and Moral Choice, 2012, asked what causes genocide. In particular, why do some stand by doing nothing while others risk their lives to help the persecuted? Interviews with bystanders, Nazis, and rescuers of Jews during the Holocaust reveal how self-image and identity, especially the sense of self in relation to others, set and delineate our choice options, not just morally, but cognitively as well. Monroe argues that we all have an innate predisposition for ethics that resembles the innate proclivity for language. As with linguistic or mathematical ability, this general framework gets filled in differently by what Monroe identifies as the critical parts of identity: worldview, integration of key values into one's sense of self, categorization schema, and a sense of moral salience. which is defined as the feeling that another's suffering is relevant for the actor, and which therefore demands action, and not just general expressions of sympathy. Kristen Monroe's most recent books are the prize-winning A Darkling Plain, Stories of Conflict and Humanity During War, 2014, and on Ethics and Economics, Conversations with Kenneth Arrow and Nicholas Lampros. Besides her impressive list of publications, she has received numerous awards, offices, and has a great number of works in progress. So we're delighted to have you here, to have you give this very important lecture in our calendar. After the lecture, there'll be time for question and answer period. A microphone will go around, and after that, a reception next door. So welcome to everybody. Thank you for being here, and especially thank you to you, and here we are.
Thank you, Michael, very much. I appreciate that introduction, and I think I'm going to have to be you have to be the alpha and omega of my thanks, because I appreciate the introduction, but I was trying to think of all the many people I had to thank for this evening, and I had listed some of them up before. I thought that would save time. I was going to try to have all the photographs of the other fellows, because this has been such an unusually nice group and very welcoming, but I thought that might tax even Stefan's patience. So I do want to thank the other fellows. They've been so wonderful and helpful. And I want to thank the staff at the Academy. I think that there are so many people here. I mean, I can't even begin to name them all. Johanna's out in the hall, I think Barrett, Caitlin, Jessica, Joachim, Mateus, Gabby in the morning, everybody, Renee. It's just too many, and since I deal with stories, I'll just tell one story and then stop at that. I was trying to figure out how to work the laundry, and I asked Carmen, whose office is right across from mine, and she took me in and showed me, and then very sweetly touched my arm and leaned over and kind of giggled and said, "Actually, I don't know how to do the laundry either. My husband always does it." So I think that's very typical of the Academy. They never make you feel like you're an idiot because you don't know how to do something very simple. They're very helpful. They're very dedicated. And I know that tone is set from the top. So Michael and Christine before him, I think it's a wonderful place that you've set up here. You should be very proud of it. It's very unusual. So they do everything they can to make it easy to do our work. So what is my work about? Well, I've changed the title just a little bit, because when I got here and I heard Michael Sandel's talk, and then I know there's another talk next Tuesday that's on the same topic, I thought that maybe it would be interesting to ask ourselves not so much how people put their lives back together again after war, but which is an important topic, but what is it that happens when people understand that something's happening, when the democracy is under stress? So what I want to try to do tonight, and I'm going to try to do it in 45 minutes, so we have half an hour for questions, because that's usually the most interesting part of the discussion. And I know just in the brief time I've been here able to talk with some of you, there's so many people in the audience that know more than I do. So I want to just quickly go through. I'm going to talk a little bit about the impetus for the work. I want to show you some of the people that I interview, because what I do are narrative interpretations. I just basically listen to people. Somebody was at a conference, and I heard someone say, "What does Christy do?" And the other guy said, "I think she talks to people," and that's basically all I do. So I want to show you the people. I want to talk about why the Holocaust may have happened in Germany, and then what happens when a democracy is under threat, because I think there are some unfortunate parallels between what's going on today and tomorrow. And so I want to end up by talking about what lessons we can learn from Germany's 20th century experience. And I'm just realizing I forgot to acknowledge Evelyn Raschke. Hold your hand up. Evelyn is the daughter of one of the rescuers that I had the privilege to come to know. I'm not able to actually thank most of the people. Many of them have died. But it's a pleasure to have you here, and I really appreciate what you did. So, okay. In 1996, there was a book published that was wildly popular called Hitler's Willing Executioners, Ordinary Germans in the Holocaust. I was asked to review the book for the American Political Science Association, which I did. I found the book had two problems. I thought that it was, it was the basic question. Sorry, I should go through that for those of you who don't know the book. The basic question was, why did the Holocaust emanate in Germany? And the answer was that there was something especially virulent in German anti-Semitism. Goldhagen went through some legal testimony of a reserve order police battalion and argued that because these people were ordinary people in the sense of sociodemographics, that therefore other people would have done the same thing had they had the opportunity. I thought this was as fallacious as saying that because my rescuers were ordinary people in terms of sociodemographics, that everybody else who had those characteristics would have done the same thing. I also thought that he cherry-picked his history, which I think is something that the professional historians who reviewed the book agreed with me on. Fritz Stern was one of them. I believe he had something to do with the founding of the Academy. Omar Bartov and a man named Christopher Browning, who had a book that came out in 1992, which was kind of ignored. It's on the same topic, but Goldhagen kind of ignored it. So I was asked to be on a panel, which was supposed to be an adulatory panel for the Goldhagen book, and Seymour Martin Lipset dropped out at the last minute. They put me on, and I said what I thought. And afterwards, there was this huge whoosh of people, either to Goldhagen or to me. And one of the people who came up was a woman named Dorothea Allman, who was the wife of Gabriel Allman, who was a well-known political scientist, and Goldhagen's dissertation had won the Allman Prize, which helped him go on to get published. She said Gabriel was very upset by the book. He didn't like it. And she said, I was in Germany. I was there. I knew what happened. He's got it wrong. So she kind of told me, well, you should really think about, doing something, talking with people. We started just chatting very informally, the way friends do after conversations at dinner continue on. And so I started doing a little bit of interviewing with people. It turned out I had a lot of friends who were German Jews who had emigrated to the United States. Many of them were academics I'd known for years, did not know they were either German or Jewish. And I got a very small National Science Foundation grant. It was and started doing some interviews, had them transcribed. This was not my major research area, and so it kind of bubbled away. As I say, life happens while you're busy doing other things. And so I didn't really do too much with this. And then, whoops, sorry. Then three things happened at the same time. The first was what my unpaid research assistant will tell you about.
The results of the European parliamentary elections.
A political earthquake. That's how at least one European lawmaker described the unprecedented surge of far-right and anti-EU parties that swept to power this weekend.
Wait, did I hear that right? There was a surge of far-right parties in Europe. In terms of phrases you don't want to hear, that is right up there with "it's malignant" and "we're losing cabin pressure." Because, lest we forget, when Europe goes far right, they go far right through Belgium. And in case you think I might be exaggerating, take a look at Greece's Golden Dawn Party.
The party campaigns with the slogan, "Clear the filth." The filth, it's code for African and Asian migrants.
We may do the Hitler salute, but at least our hands are clean.
Wait. Your hand cleanliness is not people's chief concern. If you're going to start a sentence with "we may do the Hitler salute, but," you have to end it with something better than that. We may do the Hitler salute, but that's only to show how tall a llama is. It's about this tall. From my chest, it's about this tall, just about there. These guys have seats in the European Parliament now. This is one of their flags. That's basically a jaunty swastika. If Hitler was alive, he'd sue them for trademark infringement. And you know he'd do that. He was a real Nazi about intellectual property. And the worst thing is, these guys won't be lonely in the European Parliament. They'll be joining Hungary's Jobbik party. Let's check in on one of their rallies.
The May Day festival for supporters of Jobbik, Hungary's ultra-far-right political party. Just 3 years ago, it exploded onto the political scene on an anti-Semitic, anti-Roma gypsy ticket.
OK, couple of things. A, that's terrifying. And B, quick side note, why do neo-Nazis always like metal? Is there anyone into both anti-Zionist conspiracy theories and smooth jazz? Hey there, we're Groove Step. We're here to denounce the mongrel races, but first, let's jam. This is a little quiet storm off our new album, Pure Bloodlines. Give it up for Neil Whiteman on drums. Real name, real name. Can't make it up.
So for the musicologists in the crowd, that is a question. Why is it that neo-Nazis are always into hard metal? Why not smooth jazz? Okay, so this was the first thing that happened. There was a rise. This was, I think, a clip from 2014, the rise of the alt-right in Europe. And then I actually happened to be in Warsaw right after the day that Brexit came in, and people were terrified there. So we had something, unfortunately, which was also initially thought of as a joke and ended up being even more horrifying. And there, probably most of you recognize that person. I had a pen. I'm sorry, Julianne, I left it in the purse. Someone gave me for Christmas. It has Donald Trump's head on it. And if you knock it, it says, "I am really rich," or "It's really my hair," or "I am going to be the best president God ever created." For those of you who are into art, I realize this tends to be a very arty group. There's another representation of our fearless leader. So the third thing that happened, however, was that I had done an interview with a man named Martin Heisler, and the transcript just happened to come back to me on the Wednesday after the election of Donald Trump in the United States. And as I was reading through the transcript, I thought there are a lot of things that remind me, they're kind of reminiscent. There are a lot of themes. Nativism, populism, shift in attitude towards the law and the press. We're talking about fake news. A lot of political paranoia among leaders, fear of foreigners, and politicization of attitudes towards immigrants, towards asylum seekers, towards people who are different, and national identity. Who is it who belongs to a country? So I thought, well, maybe I should go through and look at the stories with a new eye. And to prove that, unfortunately, for someone like me, it's a kind of, I don't know if it's a lose-lose or a win-win. It's like sometimes I pick up the newspaper and I think this is my research I'm reading. You desperately want your research to be totally irrelevant, but the world always keeps making it more relevant. So I came down this Saturday and I was looking at the New York Times, so it's the 14th, 15th of this year, and on the upper left, as you see, in Germany, a resurgence of the right. And then as you continued the article, there was an article right next to it said, "Tethered to a raging buffoon." And I'll just read a little bit of it. "We are tethered to a buffoon. He rages and veers, spreading ugliness like an oil slick, smothering everything in its viscous mantle. He's about to bomb Syria. He's not about to bomb Syria. His attention span is non-existent. He attacks the foundations of our republic, an independent judiciary, a free press, truth itself. His cabinet looks terrorized the way Saddam Hussein's once did." And then as you continue on to the upper part, he makes a direct comparison with Germany. Discusses a wonderful exhibition called "Before the Fall, German-Austrian Art of the 1930s" at the new museum, new gallery in New York. And he says, quote, "Peters writes of Hitler and the Nazis that they ultimately came to power above all because they were against something and wanted to make Germany great again at the expense of others. They were against liberal democracy, against cultural modernism, and hated both Marxism and Judaism, which they blamed for German humiliation. So Hitler wanted to make Germany great again. Sure worked out. Trump, of course, also hates cultural modernism. He's about a restoration he equates with restored greatness. Once upon a time, the United States won wars. White men ruled. A factory worker in Michigan could afford a couple of quad bikes, and marriage was between a man and a woman. So I think there are a lot of similarities between the period. And so what I wanted to do was to talk about and reread the interviews with two new questions. The first question that I had originally planned to talk about tonight: how did you keep your humanity during the war or reclaim it later? This is a subject I've discussed in A Darkling Plain, Stories of Conflict and Humanity During War. And then what I'm going to discuss tonight is what are the danger signs as a democracy deteriorates? What do we have to look at? So since I'm a social scientist, I feel compelled to give you a little discussion of my methodology and the data. It'll take about 2 minutes so you can relax. I basically listen to stories. It's what they call narrative interpretive. I just start out and ask people to tell me your story, tell me about your life, and then their oral histories are supplemented with very few simple questions. So first question was Goldhagen right? Why did the Holocaust originate in Germany? You were there. I wasn't. Tell me. I don't know. Then how did you keep your humanity or reclaim it later? What helped you flourish in the new world? And then finally, what are the early warning signs that democracy is in distress? And the sample were people, for the most part, who were Jewish refugees and émigrés from the Third Reich. And I'm responding to Dorothea's Allman plea, I was there. Listen to me. I was there. I know. So second part, I want to just talk about the people, tell you who they are, and the people I interviewed. The traditional view of Holocaust survivors is that 95% of those who survive will never be normal again. I did not believe these souls would ever be healed. They were people who were demoralized beyond rehabilitation, living like a litter of puppies under their mother. These are all from the report that was done by Earl Harrison, who made a report for President Truman after World War II. And most of you can find most of these in a wonderful documentary called The Long Way Home by Jonathan Mark Harris. I want to give an alternate view, which was also quite prevalent at the time, and I think you can hear parts of that too. Harrison and his ilk, referring to the Harrison Report, believe the displaced person is a human being, which he is not. This applies particularly to the Jews, who are lower than animals. And I want to take a guess who said this? General George Patton. Kind of hard to see why Eisenhower fired him for acts against the displaced persons, isn't it? That was his attitude. So I want to challenge both of these views, and I think that these are basically normal people who endured something that was horrible. They were permanently and deeply scarred, yes, but they also demonstrate remarkable coping mechanisms. And I think, fortunately, this is the view that people now are moving to, although we're right at a point where they talk about PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome. Post-traumatic stress disorder syndrome, and that still treats people as if they were damaged physically and mentally. The reason I had the kind of music play that I had, those two songs, the last song was a song by Joan Baez, performed by her sister Mimi Farina and her brother-in-law Dick Farina. And the day after the election, my daughter had been in school in Pennsylvania, and I'd suggested she shift her registration so she could vote in Pennsylvania because there was a Senate race that I thought was important there. So we joked about it. She called around 11 o'clock at night. On Tuesday, she was going to bed. I said, don't worry, Pennsylvania's going to hold. We joked about how her vote was going to make the difference. And she went to bed and woke up the next morning. She called, Mom, what happened? You're the political scientist. Can you explain what happened? And all I could say, because I was kind of in denial myself at that point too, was that we have had other times that are bad, and we have endured, and we will go on. But I think that it's important, and what I told her to do was to listen to this song called The Children of Darkness. And I think the key lines here are now in an age when light of reason fails and fires burn on the sea, now in this age of confusion, I have need of your company. And I think that it's really important we analyze things. That's what we do here. But it's important to remember the emotional aspect of things, that politics is a lot of heart, not just head. And I think Roberta Siegel, one of the people I interviewed, said, refugees have different lives. There was panic as long as I was in Germany. We kept hammering at the need of people we loved to leave. We watched the war knowing that Germany would lose eventually, but worried if those we loved could live long enough just to make it through the war alive. And I think it's important when you talk about these issues to remember that people who were there, it feels different than we may analyze it later. Evelyn was kind enough to bring her Star of David that she had during the war, and I've never actually touched one. I've seen them in museums, but I never touched one before. I was very grateful that you brought that. All right, so who are the people? This is Dorothea Allman. She was the woman that initially got me interested in that. She was born in Germany. Most of the people here were born in Germany. She was a wealthy family. Her father was a banker. He oversaw the construction of the Orient Express. She and her mother actually left what now is Istanbul on a train after World War I, coming back to Germany. She then moved to the United States in 1933 and would not come back until she was married. She was going to be married not from home, but to an American that would be protection for her. Herb Kelman is a man who was from Galicia and then went to Vienna, then moved back to Galicia. He was working class in background. He was a strong Zionist, which he said helped get him through the horrible periods of this. He's a social psychologist who now teaches at Harvard. He's in his 88, 89 now. And his expertise is conflict resolution in the Middle East. You'll see a lot of these people will do work that reflects their own experience. This is Suzanne Rudolph, who was one of my professors at the University of Chicago. She was an émigré when her father had been a social democrat. He got arrested, he got out, and it's interesting, Suzanne said he was in prison for about 6 months. Her brother said it was only 3. And that during that time period, Suzanne did not speak. She did not tell me that. That was what her brother told me. They left actually on a boat on September 9th or 10th from Hamburg. Her mother would never go back to Hamburg because they were walking the streets and they were afraid they weren't going to get out. She went on to be a member of the American Academy of Arts and Science, one of the first women elected president of the American Political Science Association, so she had a very distinguished career. Gerda Lederer is an Austrian émigré. Her father, also a wealthy banker. She taught math first and then had a bad marriage, came back to Germany to kind of get away. She went to Switzerland, then ended up in Germany, married someone and became a social scientist. Her expertise is on authoritarianism. Kurt Lang was born in Germany, left when he was young, and does work on communications at the University of Washington. He came back and was interrogating Nazis out during the war. Roberta Siegel, who's the woman on your right, was a political scientist at Rutgers, did work on political socialization. She had some interesting things to say about that. We'll talk about her father later. Peter Sudfeld was Hungarian, was a hidden child. His mother was not Jewish. His father was in hiding. His mother was working for a lawyer, and the Nazis came to pick up the father, and the mother just shamed them into leaving him. But they came and got her that night, and Peter said he remembered she was crying when she kissed him goodbye, and he never saw her again. His work is on how human beings adapt to and cope with novelty, isolation, challenge, stress, and danger. And his own work is now focusing on integrative complexity, which he says is a better theory than using post-traumatic stress disorder syndrome to explain refugee behavior, émigré. It's a picture of Martin Heisler, who is pointing to, you can see it, it's about halfway down, you can't see it, it says Heisler. And he was Hungarian. They used to take the people up to the banks of the Danube and would shoot them and then push them in the river. And they were about 6 people away from him when a big black car came up, and this tall guy who starts yelling and waving papers around was Raoul Wallenberg. And so he was hidden in a Wallenberg house. He's now a political scientist and a sociologist. And then the last one, these are just some of the people. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I just wanted to give you a feel and kind of see what these people are like. I misspelled Hannah's name. I'm sorry. I always do something like this. Hannah Holborn Gray was a very noted historian of the Reformation and the Renaissance. Her father was also kind of a whiz kid and was a star of the German history. He was saved because I think the Carnegie people came over, realized what was happening, and set up fellowships for academics to be in the United States. She was the first major female president of any major university in the United States. She was provost at Yale and then became president of the University of Chicago. And this is a picture of Gray as a child, which is a very sweet picture, but it also highlights the problems. This was not a random sample. This was just people that I happened to meet and thought, this is a wonderful opportunity to find out something, I'm going to take it. So there are a lot of limitations. Most of these people were young when they left. Some were as young as 6 years old. Most were probably in their teens or early 20s. The original interviews were not directly about the part of the topic that we're talking today, but they did talk about, as part of what Goldhagen was discussing. They got into that. I was able to interview a few afterwards. I was back in Boston this fall. I interviewed Kurt Lang and Kelman, some other people. But I wasn't able to interview everybody because some of them had died. Nonetheless, most are academics and are very keenly interested in the topic. If you lived through the Holocaust, had your life upended by it, you cared about it. And so I think what they have to say is not entirely off. All right, so just to summarize, most of them are upper middle class or middle class. They were religiously moderate, overwhelming in terms of Judaism. Émigrés had very little consciousness of being Jewish before the Nazis made this salient. Most felt very little anti-Semitism pre-war, and they were very surprised at the ease with which the assimilation ended. Roberta Siegel, speaking about socialization, since that's her field, said of her parents, but of all the people, they had the same Jewish identity that most assimilated Germans had. They knew they were Jewish. They didn't pretend they weren't. They didn't hide that they were Jewish, but they thought of themselves first and foremost as Germans. Now, she's interesting because I know these people, and it was a conversation as much as an interview. And she said to me, "Are you Christian?" And I said, "Well, not really." But we talked. She said, "Well, but do you celebrate Christmas?" I said, "Yes, I love Christmas." She said, "That's the way we were Jews." It was the same kind of thing. And George Bersey says, "I became conscious of my Jewish identity because of the circumstances." So I think that was very important. All right, part 3. Was Goldhagen right? Was there something especially virulent in German anti-Semitism that led to the Holocaust? Absolutely uniformity. I did not have one person say anything different. This is a typical answer from Heisler. Question: why did the Holocaust, happen there? Goldhagen's answer was that there was something especially virulent in German anti-Semitism. Heisler interrupted. It's not true. Guy Stern also captured a lot of the views that the Émigrés had, that the Goldhagen thesis was overstated and incorrect. He says, quote, "There were a couple of flaws in Goldhagen's thinking. The troop he takes as his model of comparison isn't quite an ordinary army troop. I was an interrogator of prisoners of war, so I knew the whole structure. A lot of these people went back in World War II and were in the intelligence or Army, in the U.S. Army. I'm familiar with the crosscut of the German Army, and as a reserve order policy group, the police troops tended to have been sifted through for their political reliability. People who were in any way suspect were weeded out of the police force. So when they put together these police battalions, they were ideologically, if not fanatic, at least sound. So they are not a typical German Army troop." The other thing that people always said was they pointed out that other countries had equal or more anti-Semitism. That was my own experience, having lived in France and Switzerland. Heisler said the Hungarian Arrow Cross was worse than the Gestapo, if possible. Stern talked about the Dreyfus affair in France and said, pointed out that the USA didn't do enough. And then he said, there's scarcely a Jew in Spain after the Inquisition, so I don't think the German anti-Semitism was so unusual. Beyond that, the Émigrés pointed out that their experience did not support the idea of widespread German anti-Semitism. Now, this is the value of doing work with people who are very careful scholars. Rudolph, Allman, Gray, all of these people are what I would call social scientists. They said that they knew relatively few anti-Semites and that it was foolish to generalize about an entire people. Rudolph says, "There are so many German identities that I encountered that had nothing to do with Nazism. Some of them were resistant, some were less resistant. So I finally simply found the Goldhagen story in some ways inconceivable to imagine, because that's not what people were like." Question: why inconceivable? Because it was wrong? Because it was... She interrupted me. "It was inconceivable because it does not describe the moral universe of people I knew, and I can only construct my German moral universe on the basis of people I knew." Such a careful scholar. So they all wanted evidence to support the claims. Question: what do you think about his thesis? Was there something particular in the German national character that made German anti-Semitism especially virulent? Siegel: "Let me put it this way. Goldhagen's theories imply there's something in the genetic makeup of the Germans. Now, he wouldn't go that far, but that's the implication. Damn it, that's precisely the thing we want to get away from. That bothers me. The second thing that bothers me is that he is generalizing on the basis of one particular group, claiming they were typical of all Germans. He has no data or evidence of that." All right, why does it matter? Why am I whacking a book that's been out for over 20 years? Well, I think it does matter. I think finding the roots of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust in national character, it's a cheap and it's an easy answer. If genocide is not rooted in the German character, then we need to look someplace else. It's too easy. And I think genocide's tentacles, having spent about 20 years thinking about it now, they run very deep in the human need to feel good about oneself and to juxtapose yourself with others. If you want to know how to explain the Holocaust, I think you're better off looking at social identity theory, which came out in the 1970s, looking at Browning's book, which is actually on the same reserve order police battalion, came out in 92. What's social identity theory? Henri Tajfel was a Polish Jew studying, I think, engineering in France during the war. And he was in the French army, was captured, made it through the war and went back and discovered everyone in his family and all his friends had been wiped out. So he changed his field and he tried to figure out why this happened. And he rooted it in the psychological need to feel good about yourself. So that how do we define who we are? Our identity is a very complex way of saying, well, who am I? I'm not my mother. I'm not my father. I'm not my sister. I'm somebody. You define yourself initially in juxtaposition to other people. And over the years, the Tajfel students have done thousands of experiments where they go around the room and they take perfectly random groups. So you're an A, you're a B, you're a C, you're an A, you're a B, you're a C. And then they have the groups cluster together and they offer them two options. So option one is that everybody in group A will get $5, everybody in group B will get $10, everybody in group C will get $15. Now, you would think that everybody in group A would take option one. And that's usually what happens. But about 33% of the groups over time, and regardless of what continent, what age groups they look at, choose option number 2, which is that everybody in group A will lose $5, everybody in group B will lose $10, and everybody in group C will lose $15. People need to feel better than other people, and if this is rooted in our need for who we are, that's a very serious problem, and I think it gives you a lot of other implications that we need to talk about. So I think it's very important to think about the sort of anti-Semitism in the way, and we can talk about that later. All right, part 4. What is the precise moment in the life of a country when tyranny takes hold? It rarely happens in an instant. It arrives like twilight, and at first the lies adjust. This is a quote about Chinese tyranny, not German tyranny, and I use that deliberately because, again, I think it's too easy to talk about Germany. The book that I use at the very end here, Ethics in an Age of Terror and Genocide, is about Dutch Nazis, Dutch bystanders, Dutch rescuers, because, again, I want to make sure everybody understands that we're not just talking about Germany here. All right, so what is going on? And this is why I chose the second song, which is an old Buffalo Springfield song. There's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop, children. What's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. So what is going down? What is really going on? First question, who recognizes the problem and what leads them to this recognition? What kind of person, in other words, is able to recognize that there are critical shifts in the political terrain and to comprehend their life and death significance in time to take decisive action to protect your family and yourself, usually via immigration? What is it that alerts them? Well, sometimes it's an external person. Sometimes somebody outside their circle told the émigrés they needed to leave. Even in a few cases, there were a lot of arguments. Roberta Siegel had a fellowship to come to. Is that Uda back there? I can't tell. Is that Uda? No, not. Thought it was somebody I knew who'd worked on some of this project. Roberta Siegel had a fellowship. She was about 18, 19, to come to the United States. And her father did not want her to come. Her father and mother were divorced. The mother was living in Italy with her sister. She'd stayed in Berlin with her father. And Munich comes along, and her father says, you see, everything's fine. I'm a World War I hero. Nothing's going to happen to me. And her uncle flew over from London, and she described a horrible row where they're yelling at each other, and the uncle says, you're an old fool. You're going to die here. Don't make her die, too. And so she gets on the boat, and she goes, and she's crying because she doesn't know when she's going to see her dad again. And someone says to her, you're lucky you're getting out. Dorothea Allman had an uncle of a friend who was very important to her, and he listened to her. The question is, why did these people listen? Why did they listen to these particular people? Sometimes arrest, I don't have an answer to that question. Sometimes arrest, it's really effective in jarring people out of their natural reluctance to leave. Millie Singer talks about her husband in a small town. They knew that they were coming for them. Their landlady told him, and he just lay down on bed with her that night, fully dressed. He wouldn't get in his pajamas, and he just held her all night. And she said when he left, and when he got back, they told him that they would let him out of prison, but if he doesn't leave the country, they may take him and his family. So she left. Suzanne Rudolph's father had been arrested, so that was critical in their deciding to get out. A lot of times it was brutality. Gerda Lederer says, "My father did not want to leave. He knew no other languages, feared for his business. But my cousin was beaten while coming back from synagogue. The Nazi youth forced him to clean sidewalks. They tormented him, saying, 'Kneel, Jew bastard.' When he refused, one of them kicked him down. My cousin then smashed him in the face." And she talks about how her cousin was a strong, athletic guy. She said, "At that point, however, all four of the Nazi youth beat him to an inch of his life. He was nearly dead, but he managed to stagger to our house. I remember how bloody he was. We children were sent to the other room to avoid seeing it. It was that bad. That is when Father decided we had to leave or be killed." And then she said later, he tortured me. Yes. This was in Vienna. Yeah.
38, I think.
Yeah, 38, yeah. After 38, yes, after the Anschluss, yes, sorry. Thank you, good question. Sometimes it was a question of resources. Having a sponsor worked out very well. Allman said she was constantly hearing things about affidavits. That was a phrase that was very important. Gray and Rudolph had fathers who were already abroad. Money was important. Guy Stern was said his uncle was kind of the black sheep of the family, and he'd already come to the United States, and he was not very wealthy. He was a baker. And what he did to get Stern out was he went to all his friends and he said, "Can you give me $100? Can you give me $20? Put it in his bank account, got the affidavit, gave all the money back. And so he was able to get out that way. A lot of times speaking languages was important. Siegel said, "My father could not speak foreign languages. My mother could." And so that made a difference. And I think then you also get into psychological, which is more where you and I come in. Siegel's mother described her mother as being very cosmopolitan. She loved to travel. Her father also said needed a lot of control. He would not have had this control in a new life. And we found this was really very important for a lot of people when we looked at surviving war. People who need control, ordinarily we think this is a good thing. But in a war, you have no control. So if you're not somebody who can give it up, you're going to have a lot of difficulties. I saw this actually in my mother when she got old. And old age people, you don't have a lot, and it was tough for her. And then finally, I think this self-concept, Suzanne Rudolph said her father was a very political person, and he just reconceptualized it so that it's not that I'm German, it's that I am a person who is a social democrat and works for these goals, and I can do these goals better in the new world, so I'll do it there. So that was something that happened. Also, hope was also very important. Usually, again, think of hope as a good thing. Hope could be a bad thing if it kept you hanging in. One of the saddest stories Roberta Siegel said was that her father would say, "Nothing's going to happen, nothing's going to happen." He was a World War I hero. I did the interview with Roberta, I think in 1998, maybe 1999. This is a very intelligent woman based in Rutgers in New Jersey. I'd been to meetings in Washington, D.C. with her, and she said, he always wrote, and he said, was writing me, "You've got to let me get you out. You've got to let me get me out." He kept saying, no, nothing will happen to me. Last letter she got from him, he says, "Maybe you should try to get me out." And she said, I never heard from him again. After the war, the International Red Cross wrote to me and told me they had information on him. I'd been meaning to go down to Washington and find out what happened to him. This was after the war. It's 1998 or 9. The woman still can't bear to find out what's happening. I thought that was a very sad and just very telling comment. But she said that this was, well, I mentioned that. Okay, so what are the critical signs that these people point to? What are the things that they notice when democracy goes under stress? First of all, truth is a victim and self-deception is key. Heisler said, eventually people telling the big lie came to believe it themselves. So I said, do you think Hitler genuinely believed it, or he used it critically as a way to get power? I've been asked that question about other people in other situations. My answer is almost always the same. If you don't believe it when you start, you eventually make yourself believe it. Second, there's a paranoid leader, a lot of search for scapegoats. Allman says Hitler was paranoid. I like to remember the Germans as a democratic people, even-handed. They know how to run a government. How is it possible they could be so turned? And she shrugged. The question is, how did Hitler reach so many people? That can also be explained, really, in the terrible economic conditions Germany was in. Sometimes it's convenient to have, and she used a word, and I don't know what it was. I was trying to get it off the tape, but I said scapegoat, and she said scapegoat. That's right. There was an us versus them mentality that got emphasized. Virtually all the émigrés said that being Jewish suddenly became a difference that was accorded political salience. Indeed, most did not feel Jewish before the war. Hitler was the one that made them feel Jewish. Just as many Muslim students suddenly found their religious identity or cultural background politically relevant under Trump. All the émigrés noted that before Hitler, friends visited back and forth, with religious differences being largely irrelevant. Hitler changed all that, completely creating an in-and-out groups and an us versus them mentality that permeated throughout the German polity. Group divisions became very important based on religion and ethnicity. And this is always a surprise to me when I think about it and I try to actually explain it to students. I think, why is it that we choose religion or ethnicity or skin color to be politically relevant? I mean, I'm a white person, supposedly. I have had light skin. I have basal cells dug out of me. I'd love to have darker skin. I mean, why is white skin such a good thing? Why do we really care what other people do in terms of worshiping a god? One of the people I interviewed was Albert Hirschman. He did not want to be on the record, so I can't quote from his interview. But Heisler referred to Hirschman, said Hirschman's father was a surgeon, and he was shocked that he wasn't given the head surgeon's position 29, 30, or 31. This is before the Third Reich. When somebody explained to Hirschman that it was because he was Jewish, he couldn't believe this. How am I Jewish? I don't act Jewish. I don't go to synagogue. I don't belong to a congregation. How could I be Jewish? Big question. Roberta Siegel points out underestimating Hitler, clinging to hope that things will improve, and the hope that the system will restrain the leader. Quote, here were the big headlines, and we thought, that can't last long. A crazy guy like that wouldn't stay in power very long. That I remember very vividly. So I asked her, you thought Hitler wouldn't last long? Answer, we didn't want to believe it. So everybody believed the system would restrain it. Evelyn's mother told me she remembered being at a coffee klatsch and at a bridge game where people were saying, oh, things are bad. How can bad than this Hitler be? We should try it. Why not try this Hitler? Millie Singer said we did not take it that seriously yet. We thought, well, it's just a temporary thing. It will pass. But it did not pass. It got worse and worse. We didn't even know anything about the camps yet. So there's an old adage in American politics that says, whoever you elect, you always get Gerald Ford. We haven't gotten Gerald Ford. Trump is not Gerald Ford. Another concept I had to come up with, and we were talking about this at dinner, you have to kind of, if you look at people empirically, you realize a lot of the theories just don't make sense. So you have to figure out something else. And one of the factors that I came up with is cognitive stretching. And I owe this to two people. First is Axel von den Busche, who most of you have heard of. And he was a young soldier in the military, and he describes being out in on the Eastern Front, and he sees in the distance, it looks like a group of people that are being led up someplace and then falling in something. And he gets his binoculars out, and it turns out they're human beings who are being shot and put into a ditch. So he calls back to General Headquarters and says, you know, permission to go in and investigate. Something weird is going on. And they say, do nothing. And that's when he figures out what's going on. And the term he used was, when something like that happens, the bottom falls out. And he said, you either have to stay part of the system, you leave, or you fight against it. And that's when he joined the July 20th plot to kill Hitler, and or the Stauffenberg plot. And he was supposed to show Hitler and a couple other people, I think Goering's, I'm not sure who, there was a nice new factory that was building uniforms, and Hitler was going to come and look at it. And so von den Busche had went to his father and told him, whoops, not doing enough, sorry. I'm talking too much, not showing enough. Said that he was not, let's see if we can get this back. Stefan, what do we do here? Huh? I don't know what happened. Anyway, von den Busche was out. Stefan's wonderful. He does all these things. He went to his father and he explained what he was going to do because there would be treason. And his father said, yes, I understand. And then he walks over and von den Busche says, well, you know, I'll be killed too. I'm going to wear the bomb on my shirt and detonate it, and it'll go off and kill Hitler, but it'll kill me. And his father said, yes, I understand. So what happened is that the British bombed the factory 2 days before Hitler was supposed to come. It got canceled, and von den Busche got sent to the Eastern Front. And he was injured. He was in the hospital when July 20th came along. So he's one of the few conspirators that made it through. Nobody ever revealed who he was. But the idea that your mind has to stretch to understand a new reality, I think, is a very important thing to understand. The other thing that helped me personally understand it was one of my sons was in school with a little boy who'd been taken away from his parents for child abuse, and the particular form that child abuse took was to make the little boy watch them have sex. Now, I could kind of understand hitting a kid. There have been sometimes I'm so tired, it's like, leave me alone. But my mind can't stretch that far. Why would you ever want anybody, let alone a child, to watch you have sex? So the ability to sense immediately that things were different, that there was a new political order with people who play by different rules are now in charge, is what I define as cognitive stretching. And I think that this is really something where we talked about I asked all the people what it is that caused them to read. And Gray said her father, who was a historian of the unification of Germany periods, he's just really smart. Michael Sandel mentioned economic inequality. I found it wasn't economic inequality so much as a just sense of economic injustice. So that the Versailles Treaty, the reparations, the kind of World War I being stabbed in the back, shrinking middle class, a lot of this came into play. And Bercy captured it. Hitler was very sharp. There was enormous unemployment, and he got money. If somebody is a socialist but doesn't have bread and butter, and suddenly you got bread and butter from somebody somewhere else, boy, he had the family. That's far more important. The guy who got him was a dictator and used this very well to evolve this for a dictatorship. This is George Bercy, something very close to this. People during this hard time want a strong leader who's going to protect them. The leader may not have specific answers in terms of politics, but he says he'll take care of you, and people need to feel there's someone who cares about them and will take care of them. Roberta Siegel talked about fear. She said the panic was always as long as I was in Germany. And I think if you read Bruno Bettelheim's Informed Heart, he makes a strong case that creating and maintaining an atmosphere of undefined terror in the country was this very strong psychological aim. Other people said it wasn't fear so much as caused the Holocaust as compliance. So it may not even be fear, it's that it's easier to comply. Let's call it the mentality of compliance, Stern says. If orders come, we follow. Okay. And he talks a long conversation about playing soccer with some boys and says, your son plays with our son. He's a good kid. We like him, but you know, these orders came. We mustn't have any Jewish people around anymore. So they complied. Oops. 13th, people didn't want to know or recognize that there was a threat. There's a famous quote, which most of you have probably heard of, by Primo Levi. Most Germans didn't know because they didn't want to know, because indeed they wanted not to know. It is certainly true that the German people as a whole did not even try to resist. In Hitler's Germany, a particular code was widespread. Those who knew did not talk. Those who did ask questions received no answers. Shutting his mouth, his eyes, and his ears, the typical German citizen built for himself the illusion of not knowing, hence of not being an accomplice to the things taking place in front of his very door. Stern again says a little different than that. It's not just that you had your head in the sand. They ignored what they saw, which is what I also found. Some of the action was secret. It was carried out in night and fog. Other things were quite open. The boycott of Jewish stores, that was quite open. So it's not just that people did not know. They did know what was happening. They just ignored it. And again, think about Trump. Most of us know what's going on. Most of us, I canceled my TV cable. I don't watch the news anymore. Last of all, you find a different political culture. This is what Heisler alerted me to when I first read his transcript. Different conceptualization of what it meant to be a German, what it meant to be a Frenchman. The entrepreneurial aspect of anti-Semitism was different in France and in Germany. There was nuanced difference. The nuanced difference comes in from what makes a person a good French citizen and what makes a person a good German citizen. This is now moving from social science to guesswork. A good French citizen is somebody who lives up to the ideals that were articulated at the founding of the Republic. A good German person has to be thoroughly, ethnically German. All right, then beyond this, these are some of the themes, but I think even the people I talked with, Hannah Gray says, when you get right down to it, it still remains a mystery how what happened, how the Holocaust could have happened, how a Hitler, for all the talent that I suppose he had, how it was possible for somebody like that to make it. How it was possible for somebody like that to be considered seriously a strategist with a military or political ability. How it was possible for people to hide their heads in the sands to the degree that they did. I mean, that still seems to me mysterious. I asked her, do you think they really did not know what was going on? She said, that is a very hard question to answer because I think probably many people didn't. But then those people who didn't perhaps didn't know because they didn't want to know. I think there were people who generally didn't, but surely there were people who did, or people who saw that it must be. All right, let's try to wrap this up. Here we have two quotes. One from the U.S. representative who's on the UN Committee for Displaced Persons. We simply did not understand what the survivors wanted to tell us. It was simply too horrible. Question, I know you don't want to talk about your family, so I don't want to ask you. Stern says, no, you can talk about it. It's just that I don't want to talk about the last days, that sort of thing, because it's too traumatic. It's very tough to talk about these things. So let's trod very gently as we try to read the handwriting on the wall, make sense of what they say. It's a quote from Hetty Epstein, who was a wonderful movie called Into the Arms of Strangers. I certainly do my share of remembering, but remembering also has to have a future perspective. And I think we honor these people if we can learn from them and listen carefully. So what do they say? First of all, I think the concept of refugees. Now, this is obviously not the usual group of émigrés. Nonetheless, I think the sample suggests we need to rethink the public perception of refugees as threatening masses. Overwhelmingly, refugees are middle, upper middle class in origin. Once here, meaning the United States, they became not just productive citizens, but also leaders who distinguished themselves by their contribution. Secondly, I think the speeds and shift in identity and what it means to be an American are interesting. Émigrés suggest that a sense of being different is created surprisingly effortlessly by public political disparagement, with few of the émigrés having a strong sense of a Jewish identity before the Nazis made that identity politically salient. Implications here, I know this is an unpopular statement to make, but I have to read the data as I see them. In favor of multiculturalism or ethnic or religious differences, I think we may need to rethink this as we recall the consequences of the German conceptualization of identity along ethnic lines and think about Tajfel's social identity theory in particular. Thirdly, assimilation is very fragile. The ease with which assimilation into German society ended gives us pause as we ponder the current political climate in which various ethnic groups are being singled out and labeled different, and racial and sexual violence increased after Trump's. One of my students, I had a course Wednesday night after the election. His mother taught second grade, and she came home at dinner that night and said the game on the playground that day was, you're going to be deported. They'd run up and say, tag, you're going to be deported. That wasn't there before the election. So I think there are a lot of implications for new immigrants to the USA now, for DACA students in particular. Conceptualizations of citizenship are really key. Both Trump and Hitler played the political game with broader boundaries than did their opponents. I think you have a very different political culture. One of the things that struck me about this, and I think it's become more evident since Trump's inauguration, we talk about eternity facts, or we learn about Obama's refusal to reveal possible Russian activities on behalf of Trump for fear that this would influence the election. Obama's respect for evidence and law contrasts sharply with both Comey's lack of concern for the effect of his last-minute bombshell about Clinton's emails and the Trump administration of Comey post-inauguration. So you have people who are operating in different political cultures. I think the last thing that is important is a trust in democratic culture and institutions. Truth is an early victim, as I said before, and people are misled and not taken off guard by political leaders who move quickly from democratic facade to demagoguery. Paranoia does run rampant, with fingers pointed at scapegoats whose removal is necessitated to protect society. The role of charisma and a strong man and nostalgia for a past in which everything was great is very important, and I think we ignore economic discontent and charismatic politicians who defy old norms and invent unprecedented ways to return the country to greatness. We ignore these people at our peril. People who are desperate, I think Michael Sandel was talking about a little of this, people who believe they've been victimized by the other for too long will forgive, at least for a while, the shortcomings, buffoonery, and angry destruction by populist politicians who put them back to work. I think there's a very strong emotional attraction to somebody who's outside the system for these people. The charismatic connection between the base and the leader ends by constituting a powerful emotional bond It exists outside the traditional political channels and works against the traditional elites believed to have sold out the masses. This connection will work against the political system's ability to curtail a demagogue by short-circuiting both the maneuverability of and the trust in less extreme traditional politicians and existing democratic institutional norms. Sandel's talking about everyone's putting a lot on Mueller. So parallels with the U.S. in 2018, well, they're pretty obvious. Alternative facts, increasing political paranoia, the Trump administration's complaints about being under attack, the alt-right's search for a scapegoat in Muslims, Mexicans, wild-eyed liberals, the objectivity of traditional American institutions such as the FBI and the press being ridiculed, called into question, and being circumvented. The view of the U.S. is threatened by those considered deviant and different undocumented immigrants, Muslims, and thus inimical to a nostalgic attachment to our way of life. A lot of unleashing of ethnic and religious hatred, uptick in sexual violence, racial, ethnic tensions, deportations. As we think of all these things, one reads interviews with German Jewish refugee émigrés in a new and extremely troubling light. And I want to conclude with one. I'll give a big prize if anybody can recognize this grave. Anybody? I mean, I didn't think anybody would get it, so I'll give you a hint. Anyone know who this is? Somebody I know should. No? No? Clara Momsen? Anyone know who Clara Momsen was? Oh, come on, all you German historians. Yes? Okay. Here's another hint. This is her full name. Okay? She's Weber's sister, and she married Theodore Mommsen's son. Now, Hannah Gray told me that Hannah Gray got her PhD, I think, at 51. She did what college students, PhD students, grad students have done for history. They go around, they visit their parents' friends and mooch off them, right? I mean, that's what you're supposed to do. So she comes to Europe, and she comes back to Germany, and she stays with Weber's sister. Now, for somebody like me, I don't know who, current songs people are, but Weber's like a rock star for me. So when my ears perked up when she said she stayed with Weber's sister. And I said, did you ask her what she made of the war? And she said that Weber's sister essentially said Hitler was such a buffoon that people of good taste simply would not discuss him. So she didn't want to talk about the war. I think ignoring somebody who's outside the political mainstream, who seems ridiculous, was a mistake in Germany in the 30s. It's a mistake today. Thank you very much. So we have about 20 minutes for questions, and Ran. Oh, sure, I'll do it. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Incredible. I'm very interested in my own personal blind spots, and I'm interested in how the emotional underpinnings of language and language can be very different things. And I'm also interested in the self-righteousness of victims, and that it's very easy when you're a victim to be on the side of right. And at that point, you're able to be monstrous. So there's so many, if you look at Trump and you look at his humiliation, he is a victim. He has all the telltale signs of a victim. And so for all of us who are victims, and very few of us get out of the human experience without being a victim in some regard, how and where do we begin to deal with this and temper it? I've had a very violent childhood. And as I've gone through years of therapy, I went through a very interesting kind of therapy that was about an emotional narrative, to forget the words, but to really live the emotions. And I had an experience when I was 4 witnessing a terrible violent act against my mother. And I was jumping up and down, this little kid, really just frightened, powerless, jumping up and down. But in this new memory, instead of the entrenched narrative, to allow it to feel, to fully be that feeling person, because the language is an affectation, something that goes on the top. And as I stayed with the feeling of jumping up and down, really the deeper underlying impetus of this extraordinary energy was to trample the person that was beating my mother. And for the first time, and this is when I'm in my 50s, I experienced myself as murderous. The 4-year-old aspect of myself that was murderous. I was murderous at 4. And it's a big shift in one's thinking when all of a sudden you realize that you're on the side of right, you have all of this self-righteousness, but then you look at your own capacity to be quite monstrous. And so we're so blind to these things. How do we begin to take responsibility and see who we are?
Wow. In 20 words or less. Yeah, you raise so many interesting questions. I don't have an answer to the question about how we come to take responsibility of the murderous aspect of ourselves. I do think that most of us have a capacity for a wide range of actions. I like to think of it as kind of a continuum. You may have a mean, which is here, a mean, which is there, but given certain circumstances, most of us can get pulled pretty far away from our mean. That's not an answer to your question. The two things I do want to mention, though, I think that the narrative that you allude to, I think the narrative is very important. And I think one of the things people are able to do is to recreate a narrative that gets them out of something as opposed to into something else. So that one of the rescuers I interviewed is a Czech who would have, and again, a lot of memory is suppressed for a long time. It comes out often as you age. And I think I got some of the stories I got because people were at the end of their life. They wanted to leave their stories with someone. This man would have nightmares. He was a Czech rescuer. He ended up in concentration camps, saved over 100 people. And he would have nightmares that the walls were closing in on him or that there was gas coming in through the walls. And he was able to get, through therapy and some medication, something so there would be a door that would appear and he could open and go through the door. What I saw in terms of victims was what people often would do. I don't think people want to feel that they are victims. I don't think they like that position because you're vulnerable. The 4-year-old who can't do anything as he watches his mother being beaten is powerless. He's helpless to do what he wants to do, and there's a lot of stuff that goes with that: guilt, shame, anger, kind of anger at yourself. Prince of Tides is an interesting movie you should check out in terms of that. But what a lot of these people would do would be to find a way around it. So they would say, Suzanne Rudolph said, I really wasn't a victim, and I said something, and she said, that's the way I choose to remember it. So I think you do have the ability to remember things in a different way and create a narrative that makes.
But I just wonder about our blind spots. Like if you look at where Hitler is with, I'm sorry, that's a Freudian. Trump is, and his.
That's the point of the talk.
Yeah. But then also, the Jewish state with the treatment of Palestinian people. To be born as a child into the Palestinian reality, you are born in tremendous oppression, and you are not given human rights. Yeah. And how can we continue to do these things? Yeah. And how do we collectively begin to speak to these things without offending each other and speak to the deeper humanity?
Well, one of the quotes that I used was by Hetty Epstein, and I said, I do my share of remembering, but remembering has to have a future. And the rest of the quote went on. She became a social activist, and she said, I have to take my Holocaust experience and realize why would then any Jew want to do to the Palestinians what we've done to them in Israel. So that, I think, is an example of taking a horrible thing that happened to her and turning it into, I have the ability to have the sensitivity to understand that this should not happen to other people then. We have to talk more about this. Yes, you were next, I think.
I recall the discussion. My name is Hajo Funke. I'm a political scientist here in Berlin. I recall the debate on Goldhagen, and I know Browning very well because of a trial we did together in London against a Holocaust denier. So what he did is something.
Who he is? Goldhagen
I will tell you.
Oh, okay.
Goldhagen did something paradox. He, on the one side, says, okay, the Germans are generalized in anti-Semitism. And on the other hand, he stated after the end of Second World War, the Germans are democratic.
Yeah.
And this is a paradox he can't explain.
No, we didn't talk about
so the truth in this sense is in the middle. What I mean is we had a despair situation after the First World War. Weimar Republic was very weak economically, politically, and culturally. And we had a long tradition, you refer to it, of ethnic identification as a German identity and anti-Semitism. Throughout the 19th century, and especially at the end of the 19th century, and again after the fall down of the victorious visions of in the First World War. So there was something in the mood of the people. And then two things you referred to that. First, Hitler tried to scapegoat the others and to say, like a right-wing populist and even more, we will do it. We will have a great Germany again, and first of all, out of the experiences of despair. And so the charisma was that. It was a social interactional charisma with the people who were in despair after the great financial crisis in '29. And then he used his own anti-Semitic paranoia. He said, okay, you will be freed if the others came down and even eliminated. So it was a historical interaction mood. And then, once he had the power, he could state a state anti-Semitism, and in a horrifying and even radical, cumulative way. So it's a kind of interaction of despair of the people, not necessarily anti-Semitic, and on the other hand, identification with a new charismatic leader who will save us, who will serve us. And then he used the anti-Semitism that is there and organized it by his party and by the SS and instigated it even further throughout the Second World War. So that was my reading, and that is different to the Goldhagen reading, because he says, oh, they were all like that. No, it was an interactional thing of, cultural and political actions within the Third Reich.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, you look at, I'm just thinking, I'm not a very political person in departmental politics. I have a colleague who always sees things, and she'll get me riled up. It's like, yeah, well, I suppose I can see that. And I think that's what these people do. If you look at Milosevic, if you look at Hitler, if you look at a lot of other things, they take something which maybe is a little teeny part there, and then all of a sudden it's brought to the fore. So I think the role of leadership cannot be underestimated. The role of the leadership here is very important. I think one of the slides I forgot was, I skipped over, is a man named Stern who talks about the German political culture was emasculated in 1848 when Frankfurt, and that was really where he traces the problem back to, which I think is right. So I agree with you on your analysis of this. Yeah, I'm very much with you. Yes, someone else had a hand up. Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
Hi, my name is Eva Schweitzer. I live in New York. Actually, I'm here for a couple of months.
Okay.
So I have witnessed Trump for, the last 2 years. And I agree that there's a similar attitude about being resentful, being anti-press, anti-intellectual, anti-big city, urban. So the spirit is kind of Weimarish. You do feel that. However, you did have a tough time in Germany after World War I. So millions of people died, children starved, economic breakdown. You don't have any of this in America. I mean, some people have hard times, but no comparison at all to the 1920s. So it's like the same attitude without the suffering. I have really no explanation for that. So where does it come from? And Trump voters are not poor. They are on average older and tend to be wealthy and white.
Yeah, there are two questions. One is, I think, what do the Émigrés say in that? I can tell you, I didn't talk about much here. I did go back and interview some of them. They uniformly felt that there were differences that were critical in the American situation, that the political, legal traditions went on more deeply and were longer and more solidly erected. The other question you ask about Trump, I don't know. I can understand, in Sandel's explanation, all these things going wrong, but then why go to Trump? And one of the explanations, I think, is it's a kind of anti-minorities in general. It's like, well, we had a black, someone was saying, they heard somebody say, we had a black, we had a woman, next is going to be a goat. Were you the one that said that? Someone was telling me that.
Somebody said
that they heard somebody say that, and I thought, you know, but I don't understand Trump. I mean, Trump will just basically say kind of anything. I do think misogyny has been underestimated. The analysts just don't seem to talk about it enough, but I think when people got in that booth, they thought, well...
Yeah, but I mean the general culture of resentment.
Do you have a question?
Yeah. No, sorry. Did you have a question? Okay. It's an ante-room over here.
Thank you.
Sorry.
So my name is Alexandra Kemmerer. I'm of the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law, based in Heidelberg.
What was your name?
Alexandra Kemmerer.
Alexandra, okay.
It's a very fascinating project you are
thank you.
going into. I would be hesitant to draw true strong connections between Weimar and the time we have now. One difference, I think, is the transnational character that we see in this right-wing move, that we really see authoritarian movements and developments reinforcing each other in turn, be it in the US, be it in Europe, be it in Hungary or in Austria. So there's certainly a kind of transnational phenomenon which we couldn't really see or can't really see in the 30s if we go back. But my question goes to the sample of interviews that you have collected, which is truly fascinating. And I would like to have you situate the narratives of your interviewees a little bit more precisely within their biographies. What do I mean with that? From my own work, my biographical work with a Czech émigré, legal scholar Eric Stein, whom I interviewed in his late 90s, it became evident that he, for the first time, talked very freely about his experience and also the way how his experience had shaped his professional life. You made it clear that in all the careers of the people you introduced to us, their experience obviously had played an important role in the selection of their fields of expertise and so on. But do you think they were very open about it throughout their careers, or was it a kind of motivation which they were quite silent or kept quite silent about?
No, that's...
Which is also something you can see in the lives of Herr Schlauterpacht, which has been described now in Philip Sand's important book, that somehow, especially... especially people who went into those topics tried to not connect it to their biography.
Yeah. No, it's a good question. It's I think you're dealing with issues of memory and biography, and I think the question is basically, did the people talk about this much? No, they didn't. And the interesting thing to me, and it was a totally random sample that I just bumbled into. It was not systematically done in any way. These were people I'd known, many of them for years. Suzanne Rudolph was a professor of mine. Roberta Siegel was someone I knew at political science meetings. Kurt Lang had taught at the same school I had. I did not know these people were German. I didn't know they were Jewish. Most of them had no accents. They never talked about this. And that I thought was really interesting. And as I started talking about the Goldhagen book with them, they started opening up. And I think it was not something they wanted to think about. Evelyn said earlier, I'm talking about this now, I don't usually like to think about it. It's not a pleasant time of your life. It's kind of like thinking about a divorce. I mean, you have to think about it at some point, but it's not really something you want to dwell on. I don't mean to trivialize the Holocaust in that way in any way, but no, I don't think these people were someone that they didn't want to talk about it particularly. When I asked them, they were happy, and I never pushed anybody. Albert Hirschman was the only one who did not want to talk about things on the record, and I think that was because his brother-in-law had been killed, and he felt just so upset about it. So I think the memories of this period are very difficult to deal with. I think a lot of times people gave me their story as at the end. They wanted to give it to somebody, and I just happened to be there.
Just very, very briefly, do you think it's only because of the trauma they experienced, or do you think it's also because they didn't want to give the impression that their professional expertise was biased by...
No, I don't think so. We can talk about this more later. Peter Sudfeld did a book on how the Holocaust affected people's lives, and he said he really wasn't very affected, and Peter's a very kind of repressed person, and the only time any of this came out, he talked about his mother, and that was when things came out. But no. Yeah, sorry. Anyone? There were some other questions. Somebody had one. Yes. Rebecca.
I'm really fascinated by the concept of identity and how really all roads lead back to the concept of everybody's identity and how situations coalesce to arrive in these places. And I wonder whether you are currently working with or considering working with any psychoanalysts or psychologists in order to sort of pass on these stories further into study or book or further analysis on the subject.
We're creating, well, that isn't where I thought you were going to go. We're creating...
But you can go there too. That's
yeah,
fine.
No. Yeah, I have talked with psychotherapists and psychoanalysts about this a lot. And I'm creating an archive at the UC Ethics Center. So these stories will be there. Anybody can have them. I'm sharing them with people, at any museum that wants them. These are not my stories. I feel no proprietary right towards them. I was the faithful scribe that got them down in time, and that's it. They belong to the world. So I'm happy to give them to any museum and any place that wants it, but they are being put together there. It's interesting, the psychoanalytic component of that. I did talk to a lot of shrinks while I was doing the work to try to understand. I mean, it's hard doing interviews with Nazis. It's hard asking people to open up about traumatic things. I mean, Evelyn, I think I sent Margot her story several times, and she never gave me any comments. And I finally said to Ellen, does she know what's in this? Is she okay publishing? And I said, yeah, she's fine. So I think a lot of times there's this particular responsibility you have if someone gives you your story. Do you publish it? How do you deal with it? How do you use it? You have to be very, very careful and very respectful of their rights. I always tried not to say anything that I would highlight things that I thought maybe they weren't sure they wanted to be made public. But usually people did. One man was a rescuer during the Holocaust in Holland, and I sent him to something, and I described a phrase that was called the hunger winter, and he wrote back and said, I just want you to know that no one was ever hungry or cold in my house. And I thought that was very touching, that was what he wanted people to know, that he'd done his job.
Can I ask a quick follow-up?
Sure.
How did you deal personally receiving all of these stories?
Oh,
How did
yeah,
you
it
handle
was hard. It was really hard. I had to kind of dive in and out of things. Phil Zimbardo called me a couple years ago. Zimbardo's the Stanford Prison Experiments, and one of the people he knows was a man that one of my rescuers had known, and he was in Camp Rosen, and had then the last name is the name of a commandant. So the commandant kind of took him on as a little pet. And so he spent the rest of his life as a sociologist going around the world collecting stories of these Gestapo people in the SS. And he wanted to give them to somebody, and Phil thought I would be the right person. I said, I can't. I don't want to do any more Nazis. I can't deal with it. It's too much. So we're trying to encourage him to set up an archive where people could look at these things. But it's very hard. I think you have to be very careful. It's very hard when you ask people to open up and tell stories about their lives that are very difficult situations. You have to be very sensitive. And I would always often just offer to stop the tape recorder. Sometimes I'd insist that we take a break. And it was interesting what people would say. A woman named Irene, well, I'm getting off the subject here anyway. I should have another question or two if anybody wants it. Last question.
Hi. First, thank you very much. It was really lovely. I'm a Californian, went to UC San Diego, and now live here by way of Cambridge University. And you did just quickly mention just now that you had also interviewed some Nazis, or former Nazis, and I'm wondering if you can sum up very shortly sort of what was the general sentiment from their side.
Oh, yeah. The rescuers and bystanders and Nazis were quite different. The bystanders, I mean, it was interesting. You kind of have to hit me over the head with things sometimes. But I would ask people what happened, and the rescuers would get kind of exacerbated with me sometimes and say things like, well, what else could I do? They were human beings like you and me. And the bystanders would say, but what could I do? I was one person alone against the Nazis. So that was a kind of big difference there, that their perception of themselves was so different from each other that it set a kind of menu of choice. You know, I'm one person alone against the Nazis. I'm weak. I can't do anything. And one of the women who said this was the cousin of a rescuer who'd been in hiding. The entire war in Holland, he was underground. And he said, there's always something you can do. This is a guy who has to, flee. He's never staying any place more than about 3 or 4 days at a time. But he felt like he could do it. The Nazis were people who saw themselves as under attack. They were victims, and they were people that had to strike back. And so that was very important for them. They had differences in worldviews, different categorization schema where a rescuer or an altruist sees another human being. The Westerners would just see a stranger. So they really saw their worldviews were different. They had different canonical expectations about what it meant to be human beings. So that John Widener, who was a rescuer who was on the Gestapo's most wanted list, and afterwards he ran a health food store in Pasadena. I mean, it's like, this is not the James Bond kind of, big muscular guy. But he was saying, I've had gifts. I was given gifts, and there's certain responsibility. I said, what gifts? I can see, I can touch, I can feel, I can smell. And I'm thinking, okay, that's how he saw himself. And he said, why would you want to do anything? He said, being happy is what people want in life. What is it that makes you happy? Helping other people. The bystanders would say things like, and one woman used the same phrase, help in the house. She said, I couldn't do anything. She was a wealthy doctor's wife. She was very low on agency. She didn't feel like she was a very powerful person, couldn't do anything. And she said, I couldn't do anything because I had help in the house. She said, I had a very good life. I had a very spoiled life. My husband worked hard, but we always had enough money to have help in the house, so I could play squash and tennis. So the fact that she had help gave her the good life, which is what everybody wants, which is to play squash and tennis, but it meant then that she couldn't help anybody else. And so I thought that was very interesting, that their concept of what it meant to be a human being, what it meant to have a good life, very different. The Nazis were people who, and this took me a while to figure this out. It's like, are you kidding me? Were swept up on the winds of history. You had to be in tune with the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times, and that was really important for them. There was a German man named Kurt that I interviewed, grew up in Berlin actually, and he didn't like the war, but he said, you have to do it. Your people demand you have to go. You have to take care of your people. You're nothing if you're not with your people. And she said things went wrong when we crossed into the Slavs' land. That was too far. We should have stayed where we were. And he had a very different attitude towards the Slavs as towards the French. They were good guys. They were very much the same. They're like us, but the Slavs were, dirty and they're peeing on the streets. And the interview I did with him, to go back to your question, is I did an interview. It gave me goosebumps. It was a year before I go back and do the follow-up interview. I thought, I don't like this guy. I don't really want to be in the same room with him. But and that was very different in worldview, different in what it thought to be a human being, what a good life meant, and certainly in how they conceptualized human beings. There were hierarchies. You were on the in-group, you were fine. You were on the out-group, you weren't. And that was a big surprise to me when I started reading. I thought the good guys are going to be the communitarians, and those were the Nazis, actually. It was something totally different. Yeah. One last question, quick? Quick question? Yes.
Aubrey Pomeranz from Jewish Museum in Berlin. Yeah. I'd be interested to learn whether you spoke with individuals about their experiences of discrimination when they came to the United States and about their perceptions of racism in the United States.
Of racism?
Yeah, German Jews coming from a situation where they were excluded, they were segregated, and coming to a country where they witnessed segregation, discrimination against Afro-Americans, but also a lot of anti-Semitism as well.
Yeah, Otto Springer was somebody I talked about this. He was not a Jewish immigrant, he was a rescuer, but he said, he wouldn't deny the Jews' humanity for Hitler any more than he would deny the blacks' humanity for people in the American South in the 50s. Most of these people were pretty liberal in their attitudes. They tended to feel that they understood what it was like to be discriminated, and therefore they weren't going to do it against anybody else. So I think most of them kind of made the connection that Hetty Epstein did with, like, I know what it's like, I'm not going to do it to anybody else. It's wrong. And several people talked specifically about the Palestinian question, that was not right what the Jews were doing there in Palestine. They didn't talk too much about race. I don't think anybody really mentioned it too much. Several people did, but not a whole lot. Thank you very much. You've been a wonderful audience. I really appreciate it.